Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the weekly DeepRockGalactic Elite Deep Dive Guide, in which I give you all the parameters and details of this week's Elite Deep Dive and help you get through it just a little bit better. So let's just get right into the video and talk about this week's Elite Deep Dive, Endless Shelter. It's talking about the basic details of this particular Elite Deep Dive. First, the biome that it takes place on is crystalline caverns, which is not too bad. Crystalline caverns doesn't really have anything super problematic aside from the electrical crystals that you can sometimes come across. And thankfully, during this particular Elite Deep Dive, I didn't come across any of them, so I don't think they're really in the generation unless they're in some random side path or cave that I didn't really explore. So thankfully, there's not too many hazards that you need to worry about. And then talking about if you want to take a specific drink from the Abyss Bar for this Elite Deep Dive, first, Dark Morkite would be incredibly good since there are two different stages where you want to gather Morkite, so this would help expedite the process much more quickly. But if you didn't want that, Rocky Mountain would also be a good one because you do have to do a lot of digging throughout the course of this entire dive. And then of course the standard Red Rock Blaster would also be good as well. So then talking about the stages of the Elite Deep Dive and the missions that you will have to go through this week is pretty interesting. It's not necessarily difficult, but it is very long-winded and will require a lot of time input. The first stage you have is a deep scan in which you will have to find 3 resonance crystals, and the secondary objective will be a black box. You will also have the Ebonite Outbreak warning active, as well as the Rich Atmosphere anomaly, so you will be moving faster and talking more high-pitched, but Ebonite, grunts, and Praetorians may show up. In stage 2, you will have an on-site refining mission, as well as the secondary objective to gather 150 Morkite, and you will have the Cave Leech cluster warning on this particular stage. Then finally, in stage 3, you will have to gather 250 Morkite, and the secondary objective is another black box. And here you will have the Duck and Cover warning active. So as you can see, this particular Elite Deep Dive has quite a mix of different objectives, and it is a good combination of several holdout type objectives as well as some constant moving. And the warnings for this week's Elite Deep Dive are a combination of ones that are not too crazy and some that can be detrimental if you're not prepared for them. So now talking about the cave generation for this particular week, it really wasn't that bad. The only real problematic generation we had, at least in my particular run, was the final stage because there was just a lot of enemies that were waiting for us around essentially every corner. Talking about stage 1, which is the deep scan objective with the black box, thankfully you only need to find 3 crystals, so it's not too bad, and if you are playing as the driller, which I was for this particular week, it isn't too hard to find them. Thankfully, all the crystals were pretty close to each other, relatively speaking, and just a couple of drill tunnels was more than enough to make them all in one spot. And also, the black box objective itself is located right next to 2 of the crystals, so if you find the black box, you essentially are going to be finding 2 of the resonance crystals as well, which is very nice. And at least in our particular case, it might be a little bit different for you, but we had a ton of stingtails spawn during this particular mission. There was honestly a lot of them. They showed up essentially throughout the course of the entire mission, and surprisingly, even though there is the Ebonite outbreak, we really didn't see that many Ebonite enemies all throughout the course of the mission. We saw a little bit more show up once we were actually doing the descent on the drill elevator, but even throughout the course of the stage itself, we really didn't see that many Ebonite grunts show up. Again, since it is a deep scan type mission, you may have to rely on your driller a little bit to help make the traversal a little bit easier, but overall, even by deep scan standards, this wasn't really that bad of a generation. Then in stage 2 with the on-site refining and Morkite gathering, thankfully it is a very open room. It is insanely open. 2 of the pump jacks are incredibly easy to get to and don't even require a driller to create a tunnel to get to them, and then one of them is in a room that is off to the side, which isn't really that hard to miss. And if you pay attention to the terrain, you should be able to figure it out, and then you just need one very small driller tunnel to be able to connect them. Now, this is the mission that has the Cave Leech clusters, but thankfully, all of the leeches are very easily spottable, and they're all in one contained spot that you really don't need to worry about too much. So once you take them out, you really don't have to worry about them for the whole rest of the stage. And in terms of Morkite positions, there's several different deposits scattered around each individual pump jack. They're really difficult to miss, and you should have no trouble gathering the amount that you need for the objective. Then finally, in stage 3, the generation was actually very nice because the black box objective you need to do is literally right outside of the drop pod. As soon as you walk out, you actually can't miss it. So thankfully, you can knock out that objective very quickly and right away. Granted, it is not necessarily in a great position because it is in essentially just this pit where, because it is duck and cover, a lot of enemies can hit you very easily, but thankfully our engineer had the foresight to set up a platform ceiling, which made the entire holdout much easier, which I'll get into that a little bit more in the class guide, but know that you can do that and it'll work out very well. Aside from that, we had several rooms that were full of scale brambles and spitballers, so make sure that you are prepared for them. Don't rush into rooms too quickly, as you can get deleted very fast. And most of the morkite that we needed to gather for the objective were pretty far down into the caves, which keep in mind that throughout the course of this entire dive, we had dark morkite as our drink for the abyss bar. So even with the boost from dark morkite, we still had to go pretty far into the caves to get all the morkite that we needed. So simply put, this particular stage is a bit of an endurance run, and honestly was probably the hardest out of each individual stage of the dive. So now talking about class setups first, going over the perks that I used. Admittedly, I thought that Cave Leech Cluster was going to be a little bit more of a problem than it actually was. So for active perks, I was running Iron Will and Heightened Senses, but in all actuality, you probably don't even need to worry about Heightened Senses for this particular deep dive and can swap that out for Dash as normal, or even Field Medic if you wanted to run that. And then for passives, I'm running Resupplier, Born Ready, and Sweet Tooth just to give me a little bit more survivability, as well as good ammo management. So now going into some class loadouts that you can use for this particular elite deep dive. This week, I went through it with Driller because I noticed that there was going to be a lot of terrain manipulating stages. And for this particular week, I decided to go with a Scorching Tide Flamethrower with a Subata 120 build, and it worked out pretty well. I took Scorching Tide on the Flamethrower because it allowed me to use the Flamethrower normally to handle these smaller threats, and then the Scorching Tide allowed me to take out the bigger threats very easily. And then the Subata was also a very useful just sort of cleanup tool for those smaller threats, and because I took volatile bullets on it, it was able to do extra damage because not only was I running fire, but several other of my teammates were running fire-based builds as well. And since you are going up against Ebonite Grunts in the first stage, and since they are just very good overall, the Impact Axes are a great choice to take for throwables, as they can just help delete problematic threats very quickly. Talking about some tips for each individual stage. For stage 1, you really want to just find the black box. Figure out where the black box is in relation to where you are and drill directly to it, because once you do find the black box, you'll also basically find 2 resonance crystals at the same time, which is incredibly useful. The third crystal can easily be found on the way by either yourself or one of your teammates, but basically just find the black box and go right to it, and you will essentially complete all the objectives at once. Then during the actual descent portion of the deep scan, just use your flames as normal hazards against the enemies to make it harder for them to get to you, and just defend as you normally would. For stage 2, you only really need to make 1 tunnel for the pipelines. As I said earlier, the terrain is very generous and you have essentially 2 straight shots to 2 of the pump jacks, so you really only need to make 1 tunnel leading to the one off to the side. So then all you really need to do is just focus on grabbing all the morkite that you can easily get to, and focus on defense during refining stages. Again, keep an eye out for the Cave Leech clusters at the beginning, but once you take them out, they're not going to be that big of a deal. Then finally for stage 3, just make sure you are progressing consistently and slowly through the caves, and during the particular moments where there are rooms full of scale brambles and spitballers and just things that are going to be trying to shoot at you, find ways to make pathways around them to be able to hit them from the back or from more profitable angles for you, because at least in our experience, there were a couple of times where there was a scale bramble that was messing with us and we really couldn't hit it without getting into a very inopportune situation. So I made some tunnels going around the side of the rooms and where I was able to find the extra nodules that it had, and then we were able to take it out very quickly. So don't be afraid to do something like that. Then talking about the scout, unfortunately our scout disconnected about halfway through the second stage, but we were definitely able to feel the difficulty increase once he did disconnect. In terms of loadout, something like a conductive thermals for the Drac mixed with a crossbow with fire bolts would actually be a pretty good combination, especially in the loadout that we were using, because we had a very big elemental focus among everybody in the entire group. The conductive thermals would have made the driller and the gunner's job much easier, as well as it is just a incredibly good overclock, and the fire bolts can also help to take out problematic threats very easily. And for throwables, something again like the stun sweeper or even the cryo grenades will work out very well if you are running the conductive thermals. And then talking about some tips for each individual stage. For stage 1, really you just have to focus on finding the resonance crystals. There isn't really a whole lot that you have to worry about for this particular stage, other than just making sure you're able to debilitate enemies very easily during the black box stage. And then again, just follow your driller very closely as he finds the black box as well as the other resonance crystals. That way you can help set up the scanning nodes for them. And then during the descent for the actual deep scan, again, focus on debilitating the enemies as much as you can, debuffing them, freezing them, electrocuting them, whatever you can do to slow them down. For stage 2, focus on gathering morkite and nitra as you would expect the scout to do, and then just be ready to quickly repair the pipelines when they do break during the initial holdout section. Thankfully for the scout, the second stage is very straightforward and easy. And then in stage 3, it's similar to stage 2, where you basically just want to focus on gathering resources and Morkite, but also you want to make sure that you keep an eye out for those approaching hordes of spitters and web spitters, because they are going to mess up your team very easily if they're able to get to them. So in essence, keep a spare cryo grenade or a stun sweeper ready to be able to stop those particular approaching hordes. Next, talking about the engineer, since there are a lot of different defense sections as well as endurance points throughout this particular deep dive, a strong defensive and area control build would be very nice. Our engineer for this particular deep dive was using a turret EM discharge build for the stubby, as well as a shard diffractor, which worked out incredibly well, as you're able to defend many different locations very easily, as well as have good burst damage when you do need it. Talking about stage tips, for stage 1, you just want to make sure you are setting up very defensively for the black box as well as the drill evader descent, and then just support your teammates as much as you possibly can while they are searching for the resonance crystals. In stage 2, you want to set up platforms for your allies to gather as much nitra and morkite as possible, and then focus on building up the pipelines, since they are again very easy and don't require a whole lot of terrain manipulation. And then just make sure that you have strong area control and strong burst damage during the refining portion of the mission. And then stage 3 is again similar to stage 2, where in which you essentially just want to focus on gathering morkite and setting up platforms for your allies to gather morkite and nitra as you progress through the caves, as well as making sure to set up for the inevitable swarms of spitters, acid spitters, spitballers, Mactera, essentially all the ranged enemies that you are going to come across, since again the mission does have duck and cover. Also in stage 3, a very useful thing you can do for the engineer is to set up a platform roof over top of the black box. As I said, the black box is right at the very start of the mission, right when you get out of the drop pod, and it is in this little crater-like area that is very convenient, but it also means that you are very vulnerable to ranged attacks, again, since the mission does have duck and cover. Thankfully, our engineer, when we did it, had the foresight to set up a platform roof over top of us, that way the enemy really couldn't get to us. Not only did they not have a clear line of sight, but we left one opening, that way they essentially had to funnel into it, and it made it significantly easier for us to handle that section, because once we got done and we left the crater, I saw at least 5 or 6 septic spreaders and a ridiculous amount of spitters that were just sitting there without a clear line of sight to hit us. So in essence, if you are the engineer, use that particular strategy before you start the black box on the 3rd stage, and it will make your life so much easier. Then finally, for the gunner, he has a very simple job throughout the course of this entire deep dive, since he is essentially just focused on damage and control. You don't really need to have anything crazy or extravagant for this particular build. Something very simple like an exhaust vectoring minigun with a Hellfire coil gun would work incredibly well, especially when coupled with the rest of the elemental damage that the rest of your team can put out, as it allows you to just have good sustained damage as well as strong burst damage when you need it. And there aren't really any specific tips for individual stages when it comes to the gunner. Really, you just need to focus on being there for your teammates, being defensive, and protecting them whenever they need it. During both of the black box sections, you want to just be as defensive as humanly possible. During the 3rd stage, you are incredibly valuable because, again, since there are a lot of spitballers, scale brambles, barrage infectors, things like your lead burster grenades can be incredibly useful at taking them out, and your shield is paramount in order to protect your teammates from all of the ranged enemies that are going to be attacking them. Simply put, just be the defensive bulwark that your team needs them to be, and focus on taking out the biggest threat in the room. Well, hopefully now you have a little bit of a better understanding of this week's Elite Deep Dive. It really wasn't that bad. Again, it's not super duper difficult. It's just a little bit long-winded because there are a lot of sections that you kind of just have to survive and hold out, or you just need to progress, and based on the difficulty of the particular cave that you're going through, it might be a little bit difficult. But overall, this particular Elite Deep Dive was not the worst in the world, and hopefully now you know how to get through it just a little bit easier. Anyway, I hope you guys found this video informative and entertaining. If you did, please be sure to let me know by hitting that like button, and consider becoming a member and subscribing today, as it really helps me out a lot. Rocket Stone Miners, I will see you in the next video.